um, yeah, so we're really lucky to have Patrick Pilarski here, who is the Canada CFAR Artificial Intelligence Chair and a past Canada Research Chair in Machine Intelligence for Rehabilitation, and is also an Associate Professor in the Division of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at the University of Alberta. He's a co-founder of the DeepMind Alberta office, where he is a team lead and a senior staff research scientist. His bio is actually absurdly long due to the large number of things he's done and fields he's involved in. But we're really excited to have him here today, talking about some work on Pavlovian signaling. Take it away, and very excited to have you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Hopefully, everyone, you should be able to see my slides. Eugene, you can see the slides. Everyone see them? Okay, awesome. Thank you for having me, Eugene and Natasha. Thank you for thinking about me and inviting me to give this talk. Thank you for caring about Pavlovian signaling. It's something that, as you mentioned, we've poured a lot of effort into over the last 2.5 years at our Edmonton DeepMind office, along with collaborators at the university and overseas. And it's also something that is a sort of a definition and a formalization of something that we've thought about and used for almost a decade now in a variety of really practical applications. So that's some of my my background for what I'm going to talk about today. I really do want to do multiple things for this talk, as usual, but one of them is of course, as I said, to introduce and describe and define what this Pavlovian signaling thing is and why I think it's really cool. You'll all probably think, wow, this is like a really straightforward, simple thing. Why are you excited about it? I hope to convince you that it is actually exciting. But I also want to share what I think is a really amazing setting for studying multi-agent reinforcement learning in a setting that I've spent last 10 years or more of my life actually embedding myself within, so I can actually study hard problems in multi-agent reinforcement learning. So I'd like to introduce you to that and maybe convince you as well that this is a great thing to study, and then foreshadow a little bit of a step change that I think we've uncovered by this pursuit of Pavlovian signaling in how we approach tightly coupled interactions between agents, and specifically humans and adaptive learning agents. So hopefully that's okay. Sound like a good plan? I can cut like half of this if you want, but I feel like this is something that will be of value to the folks here. So I'm going to start with this, and this is probably what you've seen at the start of every talk on machine learning recently. I'm sure no one has seen this slide. This is the Cairo toe. This is an example. I like to use this to start off because this is an example of one of the earliest known uses of prostheses or neuroprostheses to adapt human behavior. And I like to use this. There's a great article in the Lancet if you want to dig a little bit farther into it. But I like to use this as an example because we as humans have co-adapted with technology for a very long time. There's a socio-technical gyre that goes back for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And over that period, humans have adapted to the tools we've created, and we've created tools that we adapt to us and change to us. And this is increasing in pace and rapidness, but we're approaching a major change in how we think about this. And we've actually reached a point where we can create tools or technologies that assist us, that adapt while we're using them. This isn't like an epoch where we create a tool and it changes after we've used it to make a better tool. We now are at the point of being able to embed within the technologies around us the hallmarks of intelligence itself. And this is a really exciting time. And I like the Cairo toe as well because it is actually a prosthesis where there's evidence that it was changed over time as people were using it. Now you're probably like, this is a multi-agent seminar series. Why are you talking about prostheses? And so I want to use this next slide. This is a video from our lab at the University of Alberta campus, but that we've seen since that Cairo toe, massive change in terms of sensing technology, actuator technology, the computing hardware and firmware that powers the devices that support us in our daily life and allow them to start to take on some of those hallmarks of intelligence. We've come a long way, and now our technology itself is actually able to embody some very advanced computing technologies. This all centered, I'm zooming out a little bit to how we as people make decisions, and I promise you this all works into the grand story, is that humans in general and animals in general are interacting with our sensory motor stream by way of perception and action. This powers the cognition that we use in our daily life and interacting, our trial and error interactions with the world around us. when we start to engage with these tools, especially adaptive tools, we extend some of those things. We extend our perception, we extend our ability to act upon the world, and we extend our ability to think about and reason about and actually form those decisions that broker those interactions. This is very much what D.C. Engelbart talked about back in the 1960s. Further, as our technologies start to amplify, as Ashby would say, our ability to select or to choose between many options, that we actually amplify some of those capabilities and capacities. And we see this every day. I mean, like, we're all walking with our cell phones across the crosswalks, not getting hit by cars miraculously somehow. But we're using that device to extend ourselves out into the informational world around us, that complex, wild, woolly environment. And this brings me to the setting that I'm trying to pitch, really as a study for very exciting, interesting study of agents interacting with agents. And this is what Licklider in 1960 would have called tightly coupled interactions. Oh, I see a bink. Did someone in the chat? I'm just going to open the chat bar here. It might be. Okay, cool. I'm just opening a chat in case someone pops up a question mid thing. So tightly coupled interactions. And Licklider, I'm going to paraphrase Licklider's paper and say that he imagined that by putting together humans and increasingly complex machines, that we might soon have a system that thinks like no human has ever thought before and processes information unlike any other computational system prior. So this is a really ambitious goal. And I do think that these tightly coupled interactions are, in fact, an amazing, now given that advance in technology, an amazing place to start to study reinforcement learning and to study integrated decision-making systems that live within the flow of time and experience. I'm going to very briefly just give you one example here. This is a gentleman named Piotr. He's one of the prosthesis reps for Aether Technologies. He's also a neuroprosthesis user, so he doesn't have an arm below his mid forearm. And so I'm just when I say like tightly coupled interactions between a person and their world, this is the setting that I usually study, and I think you can see that, like, this is a person interacting in a very tightly coupled way in both time and space with a robot, with a decision-making agent that's supporting them in their daily life. That arm was trying to decide whether or not to crush the paper cup, working with this person to actually interact with the world around them. And so here Piotr is showing how we can use this for many different forms and functions and modes to interact with the world. But it is a very interesting setting of two decision-making agents that are working together and trying to coordinate the behavior in both space and time to affect change in that environment, driven, of course, in this setting by the human who is using this neuroprosthesis. Also, bionic body parts have come like a long way in the last 5 years. I just want to highlight this as well. It's a very cool setting of like humans and agents and robots all interacting together. It's changed a lot. So skipping, you can watch. I'll put a link to the video online as well if you want to watch the talk. So I just want to call out a couple of things about that interaction between, in this case, like the gentleman using the prosthetic limb and the limb itself, is that this tightly coupled interaction is really a case of mapping human will or human intent and desire to change the world to some piece of technology that is supporting them. And increasingly, we're seeing that machine intelligence, supervised or unsupervised or trial and error machine learning, is in fact the glue that connects the person to that device. And central to this particular talk, we're just starting to see that in terms of brokering the relationship of information flowing back from that assistive device back to a person using it in this tightly coupled setting, that machine learning is now actually starting to modulate or starting to play a significant role in the signaling or the communication and coordination between the machine or the supporting device back to the person. And so that our lab here has really actively studied that, but it's still very underrepresented compared to that control pathway. And I'd be remiss in not mentioning some work by Max Ortiz-Catalan that is, I think, the gold standard in terms of integration. This is something called osseointegration. I just want to highlight, because maybe most of you folks here have not seen this. This is literally something that's being done in our center here at the University of Alberta, but also in other places around the world. Max is up in Sweden. They actually hollow out the bone of a residual limb and integrate metal shunts. The bone regrows back into it. And a person can now mechanically clip lock a robotic arm directly into their own bone structure. And what Max's team has shown, and again, this is the gold standard, is you can then run wires through that bone integrated implant back out into the tissue and connect directly to the muscles and nerves of the human body to form this very immediate tight, and persistent bidirectional communication between a person and a very advanced robotic device that is now literally part of their body. So this is a very cool setting. I would encourage you all to think about this setting, and even if you don't work in it, to start to think about, wow, this is now how we are observing relationships between people and machines, and this is a great setting for trial and error learning. Anyway, this is really cool stuff. So all of that I'm using to say that I think if we look, let's look at that feedback path from that, say, that osseointegrated limb back into the human body. Predominantly, these systems are expert designed or fixed signaling. Any information flowing from that one agent, let's say the downstream agent, which is the machine, to the person, is expert designed or fixed. And there's this huge scientific gap between that and what we might actually imagine as emergent or fully learned conventions, a way that an adaptive interface that might actually start to emerge out of the interaction itself. And I mean, we have good reason to think that scientific gap should be closed. There's actually some awesome work that tries to convince us of this. And there's other researchers who have shown that by potentially moving from these expert designed or fixed signaling systems towards these more emergent interfaces, we might see increased adaptability, flexibility, efficiency in this interaction, and ability to be resilient in the face of that wild, squishy, changing world that the person and the other agents are interacting with. Now, this applies to agent-agent interactions of all kind, but again, for this talk, I'd love for us to ground ourselves in that tightly coupled human-machine interaction, just as one evocative case. And so that's what I'm going to do today in the residual time for this particular talk, is to try to show not that full gap. Like, wow, that would be awesome. I'd love to be here presenting to you. Oh yeah, we totally figured that thing out. We know how to cross that gap. It's one easy hop. With this one trick, you can, no, I'm not going to do that for you today. But what I'd like to show is a first natural stepping stone that helps us think about how to cross that gap and gives us a really good stepping off point for other innovation that will help us move towards that more emergent or learned signaling that I think we've been convinced by a number of folks, including some of them here, that we should be aspiring to. And not surprisingly, I'm going to pitch Pavlovian signaling as that natural stepping stone, and that is the value case here. But I want to start a little bit like at the underpinnings of Pavlovian signaling by saying that I believe that the stepping stone I'm presenting today is one that is based on continual learning. I'm hoping that many of you here know about continual learning. I'm looking around at the little balls with people's initials on them, and I think they're all giving me thumbs up that they know about continual learning if I could see them. Okay, awesome. But Natasha, yes, please.
Sorry, I was just going to try to give a thumbs up, but I raise my hand. My bad.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So I don't have to pitch continual learning to many of you here, and thanks for whose cameras on. I get a little bit of like biofeedback from your facial expressions and things. But the continual learning is a field where I think we can start to study this constant incremental development of policies and predictions and representations to have systems that start to learn from data and continue to learn from data without the interruption of training and testing. And so the view I'm going to give today is really one that's grounded in continual learning. And most of you, I think, are familiar then with a very well-suited methodology for embracing continual learning, which is temporal difference learning. We can go back to Rich Sutton's earlier papers, the seminal paper in 1988. And I'm not going to belabor temporal difference learning because I'm guessing that the crowd here will know it well. I just want to highlight again that our temporal difference error is built up from the difference between a prediction about right now and a discounted prediction about what's going to happen next, along with the reward that we actually get. And that error is then used to modify those weights that are being used to create the prediction about the present. And I'm saying this all because I know you know it, but also because prediction is going to be central to everything that we talk about next. And I want to make sure this is just fresh in our mind. Because I'm going to step from that, again, assuming all this is assuming a given policy, I'm going to step from this to something that actually is still within that 1988 paper, which is that, I mean, the predictions that we might make through processes of temporal difference learning, these temporally extended forecasts about the future, are in fact not limited to reward. All of us are like, oh yeah, reward's great. We're totally going to use it for like reinforcement learning. But at the same time, Rich even said in that initial paper, whoa, what just happened? Did my talk go away? No, something happened. Where is my talk? Ah, perfect. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, folks. There was a pop-up window on my computer. That we get to generalized value functions. This is a temporally extended forecast about a non-reward signal. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with GVFs, I'm not assuming any of you are familiar with GVFs because there's like, I don't know what, like 100 of us around the world that actually think they're awesome, and then most people just don't. it's the same idea as with temporal difference learning about reward to create value functions. But as we sort of put forward in this 2011 paper called the Horde architecture, the idea here is that you can think about now the prediction about the future, this temporally extended expectation, as being about a cumulant. This is a signal that we accumulate, and it doesn't have to have like up is not necessarily good. It is an arbitrary signal of interest that might be estimated. The state conditional discounting, so some idea about the temporal horizon over which this computational question is being framed. And then, of course, the policy or the prediction. This is the way of behaving that the question is about. And so altogether, this is saying we can use the standard methods for temporal difference learning to allow a machine to, for itself, or by bequest of its designer, to computationally specify a question about the future that it can then answer for itself. It gives the foundations really for the machines that we are designing to be good scientists and form questions that are specified by a signal that is interesting, a time scale over which the question is being asked, and then a policy about which the question is being asked. And that this allows the system to build predictions or forecasts about the future. Hopefully that tracks for everyone here. But in the same way, then that temporal difference error can be used to update a set of weights that might be used in a linear combination of weights and features to create predictions about the future. And it's not limited to linear setting, but I'm going to be straightforward, and everything I'll talk to you about today, you should consider it to be in the linear combination of weights or features kind of setting. Okay, cool. And so as we roll through this, I just want to say that like we've done a lot of things with generalized value functions, but to ground it back in that tightly coupled setting, one thing that we explored actually a number of years ago was, can we apply that process of general value function learning to those tightly coupled interactions between, in this case, someone with an amputation who has nerve rewiring surgeries to create all these interesting control sites on their arm, and the robotic arm that they're using to interact with the world around them. And what we found was that indeed, yes, we could, by process of continual learning, allow a system to, just by observing that data stream flowing between the person and the device, to build up forecasts about where the robot joints might be in space at any given time, the velocities, the forces that were being applied at different parts of the system or the grippers, the signals coming from the human body, and aspects of the control system itself, aspects of the control system state. So we showed that we actually could use generalized value functions to begin to create temporally extended forecasts about this interaction between a human agent and a machine agent as they were engaging with the flow of time in their own experience. This gets us to Pavlovian control, and this is a stepping stone towards Pavlovian signaling. So as Joseph Modell defined, and maybe some of you who have seen Joseph's work on this as well, Pavlovian control is a process wherein learned temporally extended predictions, in this case, imagine generalized value functions, are mapped in a defined way to control actions performed by an agent. So this is a pretty straightforward thing. There's no policy learning happening in Pavlovian control. It really is a fast, continual process of prediction learning, wherein predictions are, as they are in many biological systems, mapped directly to almost reflexive behaviors. So this is Pavlovian control as Joseph defined it, and it's actually quite a powerful technology for having a system that can very rapidly learn about the world around it and exhibit increasingly complex behaviors. Robots that can learn to predict impacts with walls and be able to deflect themselves so that they no longer hit the wall. It's a really interesting approach. We build off of this with Pavlovian signaling, and so here I'm actually going to really just define Pavlovian signaling for you as a sip of water. A process where we have those same learned temporally extended predictions, but here that we in fact now map them, instead of mapping them directly to a control action that, say, a robot might take or a machine might use as it interacts with this world, they're mapped in a defined way to signals that are in fact intended for receipt by a decision-making agent. And like I think that signaling of signalhood is, as Tom Scott Phillips would say, is in fact quite critical to this particular definition. And also wherein those signals are grounded for the sender in a very subjective way in the predictive question and the mapping approach that generated them. And so here I specified that generalized value function as it's a computational question. It's specified for the agent in the agent's own subjective terms, in terms of a time scale of interest, a signal that's interesting, the cumulant, a policy that's being enacted. In this case, say a threshold that allows us to map that prediction to some kind of token that can be signaled to another agent. And in this case, I'll just use two quick examples, and these really dive back right to like Pavlov in 1927, where you're like, cool, we have two events of interest for a decision-making agent, and there's some gap between them, something that spans that gap. And like with those early experiments by Pavlov and everyone since, you can see that, well, we have agents that are able to, for instance, Pavlov's dog or a rabbit running through a bramble bush and trying to close its eye before it gets poked in the eye by a bramble. We start to see that agents are able to, following a stimulus, begin to build up an expectation or an anticipation of that next stimulus, and then do something about that. So in Pavlovian signaling, I want to encourage us to think about is exactly that. Some in this accumulation style prediction, building up through learning and experience, an accumulated prediction as a new approaching the onset of another stimulus, wherein once that prediction exceeds a threshold, this is a simple way of doing it. There's many other more complicated ways, but let's just use this for now, that a token value that is emitted by this particular agent flips from a 0 to a 1. The converse of this is the countdown prediction, or another prediction that's readily specified with a generalized value function, which is the expected steps until another future stimulus based on a state representation. In this case, it's the exact same thing, except now you can imagine this is like a countdown timer until an oncoming event. And when that countdown gets below a threshold, whoa, it's only three steps until that oncoming stimulus. Then again, a token changes from let's say a 0 value to a 1 value and is emitted by the system. Okay, so with that in mind, let's just keep that accumulation prediction. Natasha's frowning. Did I mess something up? No, it's all good. Okay, awesome. I was like, oh no, I've already offended everyone. I presented them with a ridiculously simple method. I'm wasting all your time. No, I promise this is still cool. I don't believe I'm wasting your time. I firmly believe that, in fact. So we explored this idea of Pavlovian signaling as I just defined it for you in a domain that we called the Frost Hollow. And we have two variants of the domain. One is a domain for studying agent-agent interactions. It's a very simple linear walk domain. And there's another domain that I'll focus on for this talk. But the key aspect of this domain is that it is a domain with very sparse reward. And it's also partially observable. There's this hazard that is the stimulus patterns, those blocks I showed you in the prior slides. There's a hazard that occurs based only on time with no other state information to the agent. And so I'll leave behind the linear walk. And I'll pitch it instead to you in sort of the virtual reality domain, because I think it's an easier story to tell. And I'll tell you in a narrative form how this domain works. Imagine you're like walking through the woods, and it's winter, and it's night is approaching. It's -40, which conveniently is the same back here in Canada or also down in the States. And as you're walking, you find a clearing in the woods, and the last light of the sun still hits the middle of that clearing. So if you're really careful, you're getting really cold. If you're very precise, you can stand in the middle of that clearing and still acquire heat of the sun that will help get you through that cold winter night. And just add a little magical realism, you gain heat, and when you've gained enough heat, you can actually store that heat. You can cash in the heat by taking a defined action, and that you can think of as a unit of reward. Now, unbeknownst to you, the winter wind howls through that clearing at unknown intervals. And so if you're still in the middle of the clearing collecting heat when the winter wind howls through, you lose all the heat you gained. Not the stuff you banked, not the heat you've cashed in, but you lose all of the heat that you've collected along the way as you're trying to cash it in for points. So what you're really trying to do is figure out when that wind hazard is going to blow through the clearing, and then run for the shelter of the trees to wait for the wind to pass, and then re-enter at exactly the right time, re-enter the clearing to be able to collect more heat. And so this is the whole mechanic of the Frost Hollow. When done with a human in virtual reality, the goggles are on, a person's navigating this platform of ice in the frosty clearing. Standing in the middle, they'll see a visual stimulus. And I have a video of this. I'll show you a video in a second. Anyway, that's the setting, and that it is again, you don't know when the wind is going to come. It might be stochastic. In the virtual reality version, there's audio distractors as well that try to mess with human timing. The wind itself comes in the linear walk every 10 steps, and in the virtual reality domain, it comes roughly every 20 seconds, but we have conditions where it's randomized, where it might drift and be non-stationary through time to truly confuse the human participant. Literally designed based on the human decision-making literature to be a temporally challenging task that is very hard. The wind hazard is actually very hard to predict. Okay. So I'm going to move on then. In this, we have two agents. I want to pitch to you again these two tightly coupled agents. One agent is a control learning agent. And so regardless of whether it's in the virtual reality or the linear walk task, imagine an agent that takes as input something about its location, the heat that it's gained, the presence or absence of the hazard, a signal of reward, and also this binary signal that is being emitted by, in this case, a Pavlovian signaling, what we're calling a co-agent. That co-agent is exactly as I presented to you before. It has a generalized value function. It can perceive or not perceive the hazard, and it's tasked with, much like in those simplified diagrams, predicting the onset of the hazard based on only the hazard's presence and a number of different temporal representations. Think of it like a clockwork machine that is using its clockwork to predict the onset of the hazard and deliver the forecast or anticipation of it to this control learning agent by way of a single binary token. Again, this isn't like natural language communication. If you came for NLP, this is not your talk. All right. So, and in the virtual reality version, we sort of port this over to the human setting. So now instead of that arbitrary control learning agent, like a Sarsa Lambda or Q learning agent, we now have a human decision maker. Clearly, we can't differentiate or put gradients through the person, but we can do exactly the same thing we did before. The person in their goggles will see the environment. They will see the presence or absence of the hazard. In this case, it will be communicated by visual stimulus and also the vibration of the VR controller in their left hand, so vibrotactile feedback. They're connected to that exact same Pavlovian signaling co-agent as we would have deployed in the agent work, the non-human agent work. Now the binary signal is communicated to the person by way of vibration in their right hand controller. Okay, so this is really simple. The person can see can perceive the hazard visually and also with vibrotactile feedback, and then also by way of vibrotactile feedback, they receive the token that's being generated by this Pavlovian signaling co-agent. The video itself, hopefully the video is playing for everyone here. First person, I apologize if you get queasy with first person VR. Hopefully no one here is now throwing up. Great. Okay. So in this case, we can see that a person standing in the middle of the clearing gaining heat. They have a visual cue by way of these sparkles, and they're hit by the wind. So there's this visual distortion of their visual field in VR, and also that vibration. And they can continue to collect heat. So they're essentially moving in and out of, like, for multiple iterations of this hazard pulse. So minutes and minutes of playtime, they're moving in and out. So in this case, the participant here is trying to dodge the wind. They move out even though they see they're very close to filling up their heat gauge and cashing in a point. They return back to the center and get that last little bit of heat. And in this case, raise their controller over their head to cash in points, which they can see visually presented in the artifact in the background. And during this entire process, from tabula rasa, their Pavlovian signaling co-agent is learning generalized value function predictions about the onset of that hazard. And so I'm not going to dwell on that. But if you want, you can go into the papers and see the way that these predictions are formed. And like, essentially, there's a ton of pictures that we put in of just, here's how a GVF will start to predict a pulse with all different sorts of representations. So if you're really curious about that, the paper will have the detail. But we explored different temporal representations, not to see which one was best, but to see how the representational change in the co-agent, the Pavlovian signaling co-agent, changed the behavior of the human that was interacting with it. So in terms of results, I'm not going to dwell on detailed results, but I do want to say we measured all sorts of things about this interaction. It was a really fun behavioral study for the human. We looked at like humans' entry and exit velocity to the center of the domain. We looked at the number of times they were hit by the hazard, the number of time steps that they lost heat, the number of steps of heat that they gained, how many actual points they had. There's all these different metrics that we use to look into it. I'm presenting you one graph though here, which is a graph representing the exposure to wind with and without a co-agent. So the proportion of the steps during the experiment, the time steps, where they were hit by the pulse. I'll note the time steps here also are 8 milliseconds long. So when you think about the agent interacting, this is a stream of continual experience where the agent and the person, the world is granularized into 8 millisecond ticks by the Unity game engine in a pretty reliable way. So in this case, we see something that's very not surprising, hopefully to everyone here based on what I've said, which is that if a person doesn't have a co-agent, they have trouble knowing when the wind is going to come. And this, like, we have many different conditions. Again, randomization of the pulse. We have drift in the pulse, just looking specifically at that fixed condition where the pulse comes at regular intervals, still randomized on every trial, but randomized, that without a co-agent, the person is left using their own temporal counting machinery. And I can tell you from experience, I spent 10 hours in VR with this agent. After 10 hours, I can say it's really boring counting to like 20 in your head, and it's really hard. It's surprisingly hard to be reliable in forecasting the onset of an event, especially with a number of auditory and visual distractors in the environment. So with a co-agent, regardless of the temporal representation, there's no statistical difference between them. We found that with and without a co-agent, there were differences. Now, so what you might expect based on what I just said is, oh, wow, of course, this just makes sense. The agent vibrates the person's controller, I guess it'd be this hand, and then they get out of dodge. They walk over the trees, they avoid the wind, and they come back in. It's just like call and response. It's very much like the person is being almost autopiloted by the agent. And so I want to say that's not what happened, and that was really surprising to us. We, in fact, mixed our methodologies in this particular study to not just use quantitative measures, so the measures I mentioned earlier, but also use qualitative discourse analysis to start to get a sort of a bifurcated view into what people in the environment were doing and how they were doing it. In this case, we're going to be, I can speak, I did quite a bit of this myself, and so I can speak to this. The neat thing was that depending on the representations and the situation, that people in this environment don't necessarily, I'm not trying to generalize this to all people. I'm saying that we have examples of people that are using the co-agent signal, that Pavlovian, that token that's generated through Pavlovian signaling in different ways. In some cases, it was used as call and response. Oh, shoot, the pulse is coming soon. This hazard is coming, the pulse of wind, I need to get out of the way. In some cases, that was how it was used. In some cases, and this is the graph I'm showing here, with one particular representation, in this case, the participant here left after the agent signaled them. They waited. They used it as a benchmark in time by which they could start their own internal temporal processes that they may have calibrated against their own perceptions of the hazard as it occurred in time. There's other cases where the participant left before the agent gave the signal reliably, still using that signal. And now you're like, I see frowns, like, why would that happen? That in fact, the signal from the Pavlovian signaling co-agent could be used as this like red traffic or orange traffic cone in time by which it might be possible to, whoa, what just happened? Sorry, folks. I don't know why my slides just flipped out here. We'll get back to where we were. Don't worry. And it was, that was the cool punchline. I'm sorry. The cool punchline was like, oh wow, that in fact it was used as a learned milestone in time that could be used to then judge something about the future event and how that future event was changing, especially in the condition where the hazard might drift in time. That the signal from the co-agent could be used to further other cognitive machinery and other decision-making processes that the human might be using without actually serving as just this call and response signal. So this is a really interesting finding, and we're actually scaling this up to run a very large multiple participant study sometime this fall, where we're going to really dig into this. We're going to do qualitative discourse analysis after every single trial, burrow into the statistics, and hopefully sometime in the new year we'll have a new release of some data that will be really, I think, quite compelling to see how a human and a continually learning agent do interact in this case. To make sure we still have time for, Eugene, I'm taking your advice to heart. I'm going to make sure we have time for some discussion afterwards. I'll switch off from the results from the frost hollow and say that in the past we have also used what ideas that we would now consider Pavlovian signaling in tightly coupled human-machine interaction. One of the examples is actually my grad student here in the photo, Adam Parker, who is wearing a supernumerary limb, a third robotic arm that comes out of his chest that he can control with a joystick and get vibrotactile feedback from. And what Adam's studies have shown is that we can use Pavlovian signaling to allow a person who's navigating a robotic arm of any kind in this way to begin to forecast the interactions between that arm and its workspace, collisions, and then cue the user to those expected future collisions such that they can avoid crashing into their workspace or messing with their workspace. So in this case, Pavlovian signaling was using not just temporal information, but information in both space and time to be able to forecast impacts between a robot and the world around it. And that simple cue, that simple like on-off cue, a vibrational cue based on a learned prediction was in fact valuable and useful to the human piloting the robot. In some of our work with participants with amputations, in a approach we call adaptive and autonomous switching. This is a person and a machine that are navigating the many modes or functions, in this case of a robotic arm. And we found this setting as well is that when we deployed Pavlovian signaling to cue the human user as to the future switching or decision-making behavior of the agent, the machine, that it acted as a coordination smoother, and then in fact allowed the person and the device to get out of each other's way as they were engaging with the switching task, such that the person was able to leverage the actual capacity brought by the autonomous behavior of the machine. So that in that loosely a shared control setting, the Pavlovian signaling was a coordination smoother that brokered that relationship. We're looking at that now in switching-based exoskeleton control. And also in the Wayback Machine, we looked at, in fact, using an approach like Pavlovian signaling to cue wheelchair users when their self-reported fatigue might exceed thresholds. They might start to damage their shoulders as they're engaging in pushing behavior, by again creating learned predictions and creating a hard-coded mapping from those learned predictions to feedback or cues that were delivered to the person. I'll also say that, like, for those of you that are not impressed by the linear learning approaches that I presented, I'm just going to shout out to one of our DeepMind Alberta interns, Ola Kalinowska, who worked a lot on more advanced paradigms, which actually used deep reinforcement learning to establish more complicated conventions. I just want to shout out to Ola's work, but it's a little off topic, but I think it's super cool. So I wanted to make sure that we noted that. Okay, so bringing things home. I think some observations and I'd say claims about Pavlovian signaling that I'd like to highlight. First is that I do actually believe it is a natural bridge between fixed signaling paradigms and fully adaptive communication. So there's a learning component, there's a continual learning component, but there's still some of the things that we know and love about those engineered or hard-coded signaling relationships, especially those that are predominant in tightly coupled human-machine interaction like neuroprostheses. But what's cool about this, and especially cool about it, is that it's in fact very fast continual prediction learning. Like the prediction agents, I could throw you into VR in the Frost Hollow. In fact, I just open sourced the domain a couple days ago. So if you want, you can download it and try it out yourself. But you can actually very quickly, within minutes or within 30 seconds, start to get signals from that continual prediction learning agent. It's not like something you need like 3 billion time steps. You're trying to train a bidirectional transformer on a massive data set. Like you don't need supercomputer clusters for this. You can actually just run it on very, very lightweight computational hardware and get benefit out of it in a very short amount of time. And it can continue to adapt at different rates during operation. So that's really cool. There's minimal constraints on the nature of the receiving agent. So we don't have to assume, oh, well, this is like a particular kind of like deep neural network architecture that we're interfacing with. A human can be swapped in and out for a SARSA learner, can be swapped in and out for a deep learning agent, and we showed in a follow-up paper. In fact, the nature of it is that the system is a very simple system emitting a token, and that doesn't actually require you to know much of anything about the receiving system. The Pavlovian signaling coagent generates a token that is grounded for itself in its own subjective experience, but this token is ungrounded for the receiver. The receiver doesn't have any inherent understanding. For a human, they may say, "Oh, okay, well, I'm thinking this is related to the hazard," but there's nothing in principle that grounds the signal for the receiving agent, so that the receiving agent can use it in any flexible way that's fruitful to it. And so when we have we have a really large battery of tests on SARSA, Lambda, and Q learning agents interacting with Pavlovian signaling agents. We can see how those agents don't have any preconceptions about it and do actually really functional things with that token because it's ungrounded when it comes in. In fact, there's some anyway. A longer conversation, but there's some really cool things that came out of that, where that ungroundedness allowed it to do very clever things that we didn't expect. And finally, that I think that this is maybe the sort of the bolder of the claims, is that ideas like Pavlovian signaling, where you have this very sort of subjective approach to building the signaling paradigm, are an actionable and constructive path towards communication learning between more complicated reinforcement learning agents. This, because of that subjective nature, this means that the system is in fact building up predictive knowledge and communicating that to another agent based on its own stream of experience without any kind of objective frame of reference. And that's kind of cool. So as my sort of summary slides here, I want to bring us back to that tightly coupled multi-agent reinforcement learning I mentioned. This is now a very possible and very prominent setting that we are going to be seeing. I'm showing here a tightly coupled interaction that is published by Neuralink, where this is a brain-computer interface, a high-density brain-computer interface. This isn't just restricted to one or two companies. There are many, many, many companies now that are pursuing what we might consider high-density bidirectional cyberware that can work with the human body. So tightly coupled interactions are not just a thing now that we should expect for the medical realm. We should expect to see this becoming more and more prominent in the examples of human-machine interaction we see in our daily life. And with that in mind, I think that, again, Pavlovian signaling in this increasingly common setting is a first step towards emergent or fully learned signaling. I think what the next steps look like are really reliant on the fact that these tightly coupled systems are embedded within these complex wild worlds, that we can start to embrace the context of use. We can start to think about frameworks from human-human interaction that sort of translate over here, things like joint action and extensive inferential communication. We can think about clearly about how we assess and measure, like we were doing in the Frost Hollow, these interactions as they co-adapt over time through prosthetic continual learning. And then start to bolt on what we know from the other literature. I mean, I think all of you probably here are like, oh yeah, we're really awesome with policy learning. Like, we're thinking about models and how systems build models of each other. I think we have a lot of technology that we can then bolt very cleanly onto this starting point that we already have developed, that might rely on much more extensive computation, but allow systems to begin to learn models of each other, a co-agent and an agent, to begin to develop and maintain continually models of each other, their behavior and their interaction with the world around them. And this gets us to, I think, a really cool thing, and something that, I mean, I'm going to say apologies to Claude Shannon, but I think we are now seeing a multi-agent interaction setting where we can begin to ditch coding channels. As Tom Scott Phillips would say, that really, like, coding channels are the placement of bits on wires, the encoding and the decoding of signals. And really, in speaking our minds in other publications, Scott Phillips mentioned extensive inferential communication, whereby two systems maintain models of each other and then make signals prominent through extension, making something visible with the intent to change the model or the mind. The inference of another agent can actually pass massive amounts of information and share massive amounts of context. So I think that through processes of continual learning, starting from the ones like I shared today, we can start to go beyond code channels and actually think about our multi-agent interactions between decision-making agents, trial and error learning agents, as something that looks more like joint action between humans and humans, two systems that are co-adapting and building models of each other and the world so as to affect change in both time and space in their shared environment. So I think we can go beyond code channels. And I think it's a really exciting time and opportunity. And again, we can start to see those stepping stones that let us embrace this different way of thinking about it. And only because we now have these more advanced artificial intelligence paradigms that let us start to continually learn. I'll also give a shout out. We have an annual review that sort of makes this pitch as well, that we just, I think, submitted the final version of it today to the editors. So it'll be Emergent Comms and Physical Human Robot Interaction, where I think we make a pitch. This is Ola Kalinowska and our supervisor, Todd Murphy at Northwestern. And I have put this one forward. So will be online sometime soon if you're interested. So this gets us to where I think we can be, is that I talked about one person and one system interacting, one machine system interacting. But really, if we think about this diagram, this is in fact like not just some cool sci-fi thing. I made this in Unity specifically to show that, like, a superposition of things that are already possible. We have cochlear implants, neuroprostheses, cell phones, Fitbits, pacemakers, spinal stimulators, like pressure ulcer prevention devices. We have a very much almost an Internet of Things on our body. And each one of those is beginning to increasingly present with the hallmarks of agency. We're starting to see very dense systems and federated systems in some cases of tightly coupled intelligent systems that are interacting, that are signaling and continually adapting to each other. This is a powerful, powerful technology if we think about it right. And I do believe that some of the ideas that we talked about today, like some of the continually learning ideas, are going to make this into a very promising avenue. And like, that was a sci-fi slide. You're like, oh yeah, sure, in 30 years you'll actually see people using that. I want to make one last point, and that it's that one thing we've learned over the last decade of working on things like Pavlovian control and Pavlovian signaling is that because of the simplicity of the methods and their transferability and the lack of reliance on the receiving parties, in this case the person, is that any kind of steps we make, especially these early stepping stones, we don't have to wait like 10 years to deploy them with someone who actually uses it, like a prosthesis user at one of our hospitals here in Edmonton. Is that we can have technologies that we come up with that someone might be using a couple of days later. And so any progress we make is actually very fruitful progress for the people who are actually using it, and can be co-developed and co-created with the people who actually need the technology and actually need tightly coupled human machine systems right now. So I think there's a great opportunity here. And Pavlovian signaling has proved really useful for us, at least in this way. So with that, I'm going to thank a lot of folks. Thanks, first of all, for you for having me today and entertaining this point of view, and also to a large number of collaborators and funders who have supported various views that went into Pavlovian signaling prior to us actually sort of locking it down over the last 2.5 years. Thanks so much. We have 10 minutes for questions. Was that good? Did I do okay?
It was great. Yeah. Thank you very much for the fascinating talk. This is like a very different perspective than what we normally get to see in this group. So thanks again for coming. And I guess let me open the floor to questions. You can just unmute and then we'll assume that you're the person asking the question.
I have a question. So first, thank you so much for the talk. This is my first time getting exposed to this topic. This is crazy cool. So I was following most of what you were saying up until like towards the end when you start talking about what ostensible inferential communication. So like the idea of ditching coding channels and transmitting information by some kind of like seems to me almost some kind of like theory of mind reasoning between the agents. Like, could you just go a little deeper into that?
Sure. Yeah, I did rush through that. I would have loved to go more, but I was trying very hard to make for questions. So thank you for letting me carve out more time for this. So I'll try to do a hopefully reasonable job of paraphrasing some of the ways that this has been described by Scott Phillips, and say that like for extensive inferential communication, you assume that you have two agents, that these agents are able to make things visible to perceive the world around them. And so what's neat about this is that maybe example is the best, is like you have two people who just went to a movie and they saw the movie, they both watched it together, and then they go to a cocktail party later. And someone says, oh, whoa, I really love that movie. I saw this movie the other day, and they referenced the same movie. And now this couple who just went to the movie, they didn't like the movie. And so one looks at the other and goes, right away, like that's interesting because they could have an infinite number of things encoded upon it. This is a token that is very, very general. But because these two agents, the couple, have models of each other, they have shared context, they've co-adapted, they can emit a token and make it visible. Like they probably make an eye contact with them and be like, they make visible that this was an intended signal to be transmitted, that there's information to be transmitted. They can actually use a process of ostension, making visible the and the inference, perceiving that, to both essentially align. It is kind of like mind reading. It's mind reading brokered by very simple tokens, almost stigmergy in the shared environment. I'm saying stigmergy. I don't know if Scott Phillips would. I think stigmergy is appropriate though, because this is also, imagine the signaling between like animals in the wild where like one pees on a tree. It is modification of the shared environment to transmit a massive amount of information. Another example is like in a coffee shop or at a pub, and you're sitting there and like the server's going around looking to see if people need new drinks, and you just like tip your glass a bit and you make eye contact. It's the same kind of thing. The act of ostension allowed something to be changed. And in fact, the ostension was done to change something in the model, deliberately done to change something in the model of the other party. And so this is really cool because it does mean you could like where you don't get something for free. The thermodynamics police would come here and lock us all up if I'm like, oh yeah, we can get something for free. You get something for nothing. No, you can't get something for nothing. But I would suggest that this kind of thinking, because we can now avail ourselves of continual learning processes and massive amounts of information, is that this is essentially like putting a lot of that work that would have gone into the coding channel into the learning process of learning the models. So now you're essentially, your information, like all of that, instead of trying to figure out how to stuff bits on the coding channel, you're trying to figure out how to learn good models. And I think as a community of researchers that are looking at artificial intelligence and reinforcement learning, we're getting really good at thinking about how systems can model their world, including worlds that have other agents in them. Whether or not you care if there are other agents or they're just part of the data stream, or whether they're explicitly there, we're getting really good at this. And so we can now, I believe, this is my pitch, is that we can start to avail ourselves of our expertise in having agents that begin to capture the world around them. And then that enables this almost like, again, you're right. If you had two agents that were perfectly like a perfect sports team that didn't even see each other, that they just know each other so well, they can be like blindfolded and like scoring goals in football or soccer. I talk to my UK colleagues a lot, so I think I have to call it football. But yeah, you could imagine that you do get to a point where it almost acts like telepathy, that in the limit, you could think about being able to transmit massive amounts of information without actually having to do very much at all. And I think that is especially for tightly coupled technologies like the ones I showed today, that's transformative. That would be a radical change in thinking and a radical change in functionality for the users of these kind of technologies. Does that answer the question? Like to unpack extensive inferential communication a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few follow-on, but I should probably let others ask first before I go. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a maybe quick question, maybe a long one. But I'm curious for your thoughts about what kind of channels are available for this type of Pavlovian communication, right? Like I feel like, a thing vibrating is quite not a super expressive channel. How rich are the channels that humans can interpret? Like if I have like VR glasses, can I project different lights onto a screen and use those as channels for Pavlovian signaling? Can humans interpret that?
Yeah, so I think the technology we're starting to see being deployed regularly in just the consumer domain or the biomedical domain is very much suited to Pavlovian signaling. So we don't have to think just vibrational channels. I'll say very briefly that we've looked at visual cues, we've looked at auditory cues. We had this fruit harvesting paper at RLDM back in 2019, where a person was sort of sat on they sat on a floating disc that was on the back of 4 creatures that were on the back of another creature flying through space. Anyway, so we may have made a small disc world, and we had like fruit that was dropping from the sky, and a person had to learn the value of the fruit through interacting with it. And then they also worked to teach their co-agent, their Pavlovian signaling co-agents. They actually, when they started to latch on to like what color and saturation value was worth points, they could teach a co-agent, and that co-agent would then start to generate cues for them. So while someone might be over in one corner of the disc world collecting fruit, they might hear an auditory cue of a certain tone, and then they'd know that, oh, a fruit that's valuable to me according to my own preferences just spawned over here, and then they'd be able to go and try to harvest that fruit. So that auditory channel, if done well, was very functional for use in Pavlovian signaling. If done poorly, it was a nightmare. There's just like sounds everywhere. So that we actually deployed, we bootstrapped onto Pavlovian signaling, almost a bandit style control learning algorithm to help sort of gate the feedback as well. So that's going a bit beyond Pavlovian signaling. Visual stimulus as well. We've looked at various game environments, similar kind of like optimal patch foraging experiments where we do actually see visual stimulus being possible for heads up displays. I've always thought about modifying the agent being able to modify that visual buffer, the visual, auditory, and tactile buffer for a person interacting with their environment. So yeah, I think those all work. Going back to the osseointegration example, we also have like all sorts of wires that are now going into the skin and into the nerves and into the muscles. Those are viable channels too. And there's some really cool work that I just saw at the big myoelectric control symposium, and I'll say it now just to maybe scare everyone a little bit, is that they were looking at transfecting the human peripheral nervous system with optoviruses to essentially allow the stimulation of the peripheral nervous system just with light. So you got like, I'm going to be a bit extreme with and say, like, go to your local tattoo shop and you get, not only do you get your tat done on your forearm, but they also like transfect the peripheral nerves under that to essentially be receptive to light stimulus and actually communicate to the brain. So like, that technology is actually something that exists. I'm joking when I could say you could go to like a tattoo shop and get it done, but you can imagine that there's these other very sort of low invasiveness, once the procedure is done, interactions with the human peripheral and central nervous system that are now becoming possible, that are really like, they're neat, like are especially with respect to neural signals. There's a lot of like bursty firing already happening. And so those are also vectors for Pavlovian signaling. For agents that are interacting with other machine agents, then it's really cool. Like you could just take a couple of pixels out, and unless your ConvNet is messing with you and like washes them out, you could imagine just picking an individual channel in a pixel buffer of an agent and having a co-agent use that to modify its decision-making. Ditto for the auditory buffer, ditto for any of the other multimodal channels going into any kind of network, shallow or deep, and any of its latent space. So I think there's really cool potential there to like bolt on powerful decision-making without like having to worry about where all your gradients are flowing and figuring all of that out and making complicated co-agents. Sorry, that was long-winded answer, Eugene.
Yeah. Thank you for the answer. I think we have time for one more quick question. So if somebody has one like question on the shorter end.
I can take it. Yeah, if that's okay. Yeah, so I've done a little bit of work on emergent communication in the past, completely independent of the application that we talked about today. So there's this concept of ambiguity in terms of like, how does a receiver interpret the symbol sent by a sender, right? So like the way I think about it, it's kind of like a double-edged sword. Like from the sender's perspective, it lets you compress a lot more information into just one symbol. So you can have like a much smaller set of vocabulary to encode more like semantic meaning, I guess.
Mhm.
And then, but from the receiver side, ambiguity can be kind of bad. Like if you misinterpret something, and you do something that the sender doesn't want you to do, that's kind of a bad case, especially in application where you have like metal rods stuck in your bone marrow and whatever. So like, how do you think about ambiguity in the context of like safe real world deployments for this kind of application?
I think a lot of the work we've done on context, I apologize, I think I'll take us probably 2 minutes over the end stop of this, my answer. But I think one thing that we've known, like, especially in a neuroprosthesis, there's a very like large amount of ambiguity. The devices are ridiculously straightforward in terms of their ability to perceive the world around them. And so, in fact, there is like any given signal from a person could, in theory, be received in many different ways. And so one thing that we've noticed is that the more we can start to increase the ability of the system to perceive the context of use, the more it can build up functional, like especially for control systems that have either supervised or unsupervised or reinforcement learning based control mechanisms, that we start to add extra context. Like we literally built a 3D printed robot hand with a camera in the palm for exactly this reason, to like scale up instead of trying to do the thing that most control engineers do in the setting, especially those that are building biomedical devices. Okay, we've got like 100,000 signals. We need to do something like PCA to get down to like 2. And then we're going to build a control algorithm based on those 2 signals. I think the way that we've seen to get around the ambiguity is in fact the reverse of that, which is, yeah, we've got a lot of signals. Let's blow that up into an even bigger signal space and then work really hard on how we allow the system to make use of that rich context in a computationally tractable way. That's given us really like some of these, like, yeah, the sender, like, again, this is, imagine we're not even talking emergent, but we have some kind of adaptive yet mostly hand designed communication channel between the 2 parties. The work we've done on context has been something that's paid off like more than any of the other things. Like, oh yeah, we could have like a fancy route. Actually, we don't need better prediction learning accuracy. Like we've tried, oh, well, what if we make really accurate predictors? No, it doesn't actually make anything better. But giving those predictors, even if their predictions are kind of flaky because they're using so much information, that low accuracy predictions that still forecast some future events because they have a richer context have like been really powerful in solving some of those hard problems. So I think I'm still focused on context. This is the thing that I think is most important. And context, it doesn't require us to be like, you're making soup or you're in the gym. Like if I have to go in and hand label every context of use, it might be okay, but that's still just, I don't feel like that's the right answer. I do think it's that our learning machines need to be better able to handle the fact that the world is massively bigger than they are, and that they will be in some situations which are consistent and some which are not, and use that to broker that emergent communication channel. That's my 2 cents, and that's where I'm doubling. I can just say disclaimer. That's where I'm doubling down for the next little while is really seeing where we can get mileage out of context.
I see. Thank you for the answer. And sorry, Gene, that was a long question.
No. So yeah, I just want to say again, thanks so much for coming and presenting. This was a great talk. Yeah.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. And it was nice to see all of you virtually. And someday I may see some of you in 3D as well. Thank you again for having me and entertaining Pavlovian signaling.
Thank you.
Thanks.